The bell does not stop ringing. That is the first thing you notice, and it is the thing that tells you everything is already over. Not the smell, not the carts, not the boarded doors. It is the bell. You have lived inside its rhythms your entire life, the same way you have lived inside the rhythm of market days and harvest weeks and the first frost. A bell rings for a death. A bell rings for a wedding. A bell rings at the canonical hours to mark the passage of time that otherwise pools and flattens. The bell gives shape to days that would otherwise have no shape. In your town, in the late summer of 1348, the bell has been ringing since before dawn. It has not stopped. It is still ringing now in the thick heat of afternoon. And the sexton who pulls the rope has been pulling it so long that his palms have opened and bled, and he has wrapped cloth around his hands and kept pulling. He will pull until he cannot. When he falls ill in 3 days, there will be no one left to replace him. The bell will stop, not because the dead stop arriving, but because the man who marks them has joined them. That is the first thing you must understand about dying from the Black Death. It does not arrive like a story. It does not announce itself with appropriate gravity. It arrives as a disruption in the rhythm of a rope being pulled, a change in the interval between one toll and the next, a frequency that climbs past what is possible for ordinary sickness and enters a register that has no precedent in anyone's living memory. The people in your town have survived fevers. They have survived dysentery and infected wounds and the grinding winter illnesses that take the very old and the very young with reliable annual efficiency. They have a working relationship with death. They know its tempo. They have built an entire social architecture around its management, from the priest who administers last rites to the gravedigger who opens the earth to the widow who inherits the shop. What they have not survived is this. The bell was ringing twice a week in early August, then every day, then twice a day. Now it is ringing in the morning and again before midday and again in the afternoon. And the sound has stopped feeling like ritual and started feeling like pressure, like something mechanical and relentless bearing down on the town from above. The sexton no longer knows whose deaths he is marking, till he has stopped keeping count. The parish register, which records baptisms and deaths and marriages in careful ink, has fallen 2 weeks behind because the priest who maintains it is tending to the sick in 3 households simultaneously and has not had time to sit at the writing desk. The pages are blank. The deaths are accumulating faster than they can be written down. You live in this town. You work in this town. Your household contains your wife, 2 children, your wife's mother, and an apprentice who sleeps in the corner near the hearth. You have not yet fallen ill. This does not mean you are safe. It means that the coin has not yet landed. This is the story of what happens before it does. The town you inhabit is not a large city. It is not London or Florence or Paris, not one of the massive urban bodies where the plague will eventually kill tens of thousands in concentrated waves. It is a market town, the kind that exists in countless variations across 14th century Europe. Perhaps 3,000 people inside the walls, another 1,000 scattered across the surrounding parishes and farmsteads that depend on it for trade and ecclesiastical services. It sits at the junction of 2 regional roads, which is why it exists at all. Roads bring merchants. Merchants bring money. Money builds walls and a market square and a parish church large enough to serve everyone within a half-day's walk. Those same roads brought the plague. In your town, as in every town, the physical geography of daily life is dense and intimate in ways that require getting used to before you can understand what they mean. The main street is wide enough for 2 carts to pass with difficulty. The side streets are narrower, the alleys between buildings are narrower still, and in some places, 2 people walking in opposite directions must turn sideways to pass each other. The buildings along the main street have ground-floor shops opening onto the street, workshops in back, sleeping quarters above. Families occupy these spaces in their entirety, generations layered into a single building the way sediment layers into stone over time. The house you work and sleep in is timber-framed, with wattle and daub infill between the wooden members. The ground floor is packed earth. In summer, the windows stand open because there is no glass, only wooden shutters that can be pulled closed against rain or cold. The hearth is in the center of the main room. Smoke rises to a hole in the roof. When the shutters are closed and the fire burns, the interior fills with a thin haze that settles into everything. The straw on the floor, the hanging herbs, the wool blankets, the hair and skin of everyone who sleeps there. You have never noticed this smell because you have lived inside it your entire life. 6 people sleep in this building. In summer, there is more space because you can sleep with the shutters open and the night air moving through. In winter, everyone moves closer together for warmth. The apprentice's corner is separated from the family's sleeping area by a hanging cloth. Your wife's mother occupies a pallet near the hearth because her joints trouble her in cold weather. Your children sleep on a shared pallet near the window, where they argue every night about proximity. None of this strikes you as unusual. This is simply where you live. The courtyard behind your building is shared with 2 neighboring households. The well serving your immediate block is 30 feet from your back door. 3 households draw water from it every morning. A 4th household's pig pen occupies the corner of the courtyard nearest the wall, and in warm weather the smell carries. Flies are constant in summer. You stopped noticing them years ago. Your neighbor's cat brings dead rats to the doorstep every few weeks and expects acknowledgement for this service. You kick the bodies into the alley drain without particular attention. Rats are a permanent feature of the grain storage near the market. The mill has them, the baker's storehouse has them, and they live in the spaces between buildings and in the thatch of older roofs and in the straw floors of stables. They are understood to be a nuisance rather than a catastrophe. Nobody connects them to anything larger. Nobody yet understands that they need to. The market operates twice a week on regular days, and on feast days the square fills with additional vendors who come in from the surrounding countryside. You know most of them by face, if not by name. The cloth merchant who comes up from the southern road brings news from the larger towns beyond. He was here 3 weeks ago, and he mentioned ships arriving in a port city far to the south, with crews that were dead or dying. He said the story was coming from multiple sources, which made it harder to dismiss. He said the sickness moved fast. He said some accounts described a swelling under the arm or in the groin that turned black. He sold his cloth and left, and you thought about it for a day and then did not think about it again. Rumors reach market towns constantly. They travel faster than truth and carry more weight than evidence. Every year there are stories of armies massing on distant borders, of floods swallowing riverside towns, of miraculous healings at distant shrines. Most of them dissolve before they can be verified. Some of them turn out to contain a fragment of accuracy surrounded by a large volume of elaboration. You have learned to hold rumors loosely, to process them as information that might become relevant or might simply fade. You held this one loosely. The mistake was not unreasonable. It was the same mistake every town in Europe was making simultaneously, all the way back along the route the plague was traveling. The first person in your immediate neighborhood who falls ill is the tailor's wife, who lives 4 doors down on the same side of the street. Her husband comes to the door of your workshop on a Tuesday morning and says she has a fever. His voice is flat, matter-of-fact, the way a craftsman's voice sounds when he is managing a problem rather than displaying emotion. Fever is managed. Fever is routine. His wife is stronger than most. She will likely be improved by the end of the week. He wants to know if your wife can check on her midday, as he has a commission that must be finished before Saturday. Your wife takes a bowl of pottage at midday and goes 4 doors down. She comes back quieter than she left. She says the fever is high. She says the woman's neck on one side is swollen in a way she has not seen before, a hard knot the size of a plum sitting below the ear, and the skin over it is tight and dark. She says the woman is not speaking clearly. She says the room smelled heavily of the sick smell. the particular close stench of a body working hard against something internal, and that the two children were sitting against the far wall watching their mother with the flat eyes that children develop when they are frightened past the capacity for noise. Your wife recites this with precision, the way she recites everything that worries her. She does not catastrophize. She states what she saw and waits for you to respond. You tell her to wash her hands with the vinegar water, and the mixture the apothecary suggested last winter for general illness prevention. You tell her to wait and see. You tell her that fevers with swelling occur, that the parish physician has seen similar presentations in past years. She washes her hands. She waits. The tailor's wife is dead in 4 days. 4 days is not the shock. You have known people to die of fever inside a week. What is strange is the speed of the deterioration, which your wife reports with increasing alarm after each midday visit. By the 2nd day, the swelling had grown and spread down toward the collarbone, and the woman was crying from pain. By the 3rd day, there were other swellings, a cluster of them under her arm on the same side, and the skin had developed dark blotches around them. By the 4th day, she was unresponsive, and her breathing had the thick, wet quality that you associate with the last hours of a serious lung illness. She never recovered clarity after the 1st day. 4 days from visible health to death. That is the tempo that will define every death to follow. The tailor himself begins coughing on the 5th day. He tells his neighbors he has caught a minor cold from sitting with his wife during her illness. He looks pale, and his eyes have a brightness that is not health, but fever. He keeps his shop open. He accepts commissions. He sends his apprentice to pick up thread from the market. On the 6th day, the apprentice falls ill. This is the mechanism. This is how it moves. Not through dramatic visible contagion, not through obvious transmission that anyone can trace and interrupt. Through the ordinary transactions of ordinary life. Through a bowl of soup carried by a caring neighbor. Through thread handled by the wrong hands. Through a shared well. Through a doorstep conversation that lasts slightly too long in the wrong wind direction. The plague does not announce its path. It follows the paths that already exist, the ones worn smooth by years of market transactions and neighborhood obligations and family duty. By the time the tailor dies on the 7th day, there are 3 other households on your street reporting sudden fever. The parish priest is a man of roughly 50, thick-bodied with calloused hands that speak to a rural background before he entered orders. He is practical in the way of men who have managed communities through ordinary cycles of death and seasonal hardship. So he administers the last rites with speed and competence. He keeps the parish register in a careful hand. He knows most of his parishioners by name, knows which families tithe reliably and which need reminders, knows which households have histories of illness and which old people are near their natural end. He has been administering last rites continuously for 6 days. He sleeps 3 to 4 hours out of every 24. He moves between households, carrying his kit of sacred oil and his breviary and his small portable vessel for holy water. The sick want the sacraments. The dying want absolution. This is not a request he can decline. The theology is explicit. A person who dies without last rites dies in an uncertain spiritual state. He is exposed to the full weight of accumulated sin without the formal mechanism of forgiveness that the Church administers. In a world where the afterlife is as structurally real as the market square, denying last rites to the dying is not an option the priest considers. He enters infected houses 10 times in a single day. He touches the hands of the dying. He leans close to administer oil. He breathes the same air that the feverish bodies of the dying have been saturating with exhalation for days. He moves from one household to the next without any mechanism for cleaning what cannot be seen. He does not know what he is carrying. The concept of contagion he operates with is based on bad air, on miasma, on the theory that illness emanates from corrupted atmospheric conditions rather than from biological agents too small to observe. Washing his hands would not occur to him as a meaningful precaution because hands are not, within his understanding of disease, the relevant vector. He is spreading the plague between households as efficiently as any mechanism that could be designed for the purpose. He knows something is wrong with the scale of what is happening. He does not know how to stop doing what he is doing because what he is doing is his entire function within the community. The sick need him. The dying need him more. When a family sends a child to bang on the rectory door at midnight because the grandmother has deteriorated, he rises, dresses, takes his kit, and goes. He has done this his entire working life. He will keep doing it until he cannot. He begins to feel unwell on the 8th day of the outbreak's visible presence in the parish. By the 9th day, the headache behind his eyes has become a pressure rather than a pain, a steady mechanical force that disrupts his ability to focus on the words of the prayers he has said 10,000 times. He attributes it to exhaustion, which is true, but incomplete. He eats less than he should. He drinks water from the rectory well and continues to work. On the 10th day, he finds a swelling below his left ear while washing his face. It is the size of a hazelnut. It is warm to the touch and slightly tender. He presses it twice with his finger and then stops pressing it. He finishes washing his face, says the morning office, and goes out to administer last rites to a weaver's family 2 streets over. By the 11th day, the hazelnut has become a fist. He dies on the 14th day of the outbreak. The assistant priest, a younger man not yet 30, takes over. He has watched his superior sicken and die in 4 days, and he has prayed for protection, and he is afraid in the way that people are afraid when they can see the mechanism clearly, but cannot stop it. He too goes to the sick. He too enters the houses. He also has no alternative within the structure that defines his existence and his obligations. He lasts 9 days before he shows symptoms. The third priest, who comes from a neighboring parish to fill the gap, lasts 6. The market does not close when the first deaths occur. It does not close when the second wave of deaths occurs. It does not close when the number of visible sick in the town streets reaches the point where any reasonably observant person walking through the main square can count 7 or 8 people moving with the careful slowness of fever. The market does not close because closing the market means closing the mechanism by which most of the town's households sustain themselves. You have a workshop. You make goods and you sell them. The income from what you sell pays for the grain you do not grow because you do not own land. It pays for the candles, the fuel, the additional cloth for the children's winter cloaks, the small fees that accumulate around ordinary medieval life. The parish dues, the guild fees, the market stall, rent on the days when your apprentice needs to sell independently. It pays the rent on the building you occupy, which is owned by a merchant who lives on the other end of town and collects it every quarter without consideration for whatever is happening in the world when the quarter ends. Missing a week of market is not an abstraction. It is a number of meals fewer than your household needs. It is the rent falling short. It is the gap between what you owe and what you have widening in a way that does not close easily. So you go. You stand in the market on the 3rd Tuesday after the outbreak becomes clearly visible, and you sell what you have made, and you notice that the crowd is thinner than usual. 3 of the regular vendors from the South Road are absent. A cheese seller you have known for years has sent his son instead, and the son, when asked where the father is, looks at the ground and says he is unwell. The grain merchant from the mill has raised his prices slightly, and when pressed, offers no explanation, but the explanation is obvious. There are fewer carters willing to travel the roads, fewer workers at the mill loading grain into sacks, fewer certainties about supply. The market is operating. The market is also beginning to hollow. You sell what you brought. You buy what you need. You notice that the woman at the bread stall is moving more carefully than usual, that her hands, when she counts your coins, are trembling slightly. You tell yourself this might be cold, might be ordinary tiredness. You take your bread and you go. She's not at the stall the following week. Nobody takes her place. The stall stands empty and the space around it feels strange, the way a mouth feels after a tooth has been pulled. Wrong in a way that the tongue keeps returning to despite knowing the tooth is gone and will not be coming back. Inside your household, the rules have shifted without anyone announcing the shift. Your wife no longer lets the children play in the shared courtyard. She does not explain this to the children in terms of plague or death, because she does not want them to understand the full weight of what is happening. She tells them the weather is uncertain. She tells them there are tasks inside. The children accept this for 3 days and then begin arguing, and she holds the line with an inflexibility that is itself a form of information. She is frightened. She is managing that fear by controlling what she can control, which is the perimeter of her household. Your wife's mother, who is 63 and has survived every illness that has passed through this town in the last 4 decades, says she has seen fever seasons before and that this one will pass like the others. She says this with the certainty of long experience, the bedrock confidence that comes from having been right about this kind of thing repeatedly across the span of a life. She is not being foolish. She is applying an entirely reasonable model to a situation in which that model no longer applies. The model has simply never been wrong before. The apprentice, who is 14, sleeps in his corner and watches everything and says very little. He's at an age where he processes the world primarily through observation rather than speech, cataloging everything and revealing almost nothing. You catch him looking at you sometimes with an expression you cannot entirely read, something between question and assessment. He wants to know if you are frightened. He wants to know if the adults have a plan. You do not tell him either answer, which he correctly interprets as its own kind of answer. At night, when the household is asleep, you sit near the banked fire and you think about the tailor's wife, who was alive and planning her garden 3 weeks ago, and you try to construct a rational account of why you and your household are not in her position. The rational account keeps falling apart. You are not in the tailor's household. Your wife was, briefly, but she has not fallen ill. The apprentice went to the market and came back with thread from the same vendor the tailor's apprentice used, and the tailor's apprentice is now dead. There is no rational account. There is only exposure and luck and the arithmetic of who happened to be standing where on which afternoon. This is the understanding that medieval medicine cannot give you, and that begins emerging in your awareness anyway, through the evidence of your own observation, like a shape forming in fog. You cannot see it clearly, but you can feel its outline. You bank the fire and you go to bed, and you check your neck and armpits carefully in the darkness before you sleep. Nothing yet. The apothecary's shop on the north side of the market square is the closest thing your town has to a center of medical knowledge. The apothecary is not a physician, not trained in the university medical tradition that produces the learned practitioners available to wealthy urban households. He is a man of considerable practical knowledge, accumulated over decades of treating everything that ordinary illness produces. Infected wounds, difficult births, persistent coughs, the routine bone-deep exhaustion of aging bodies. He mixes remedies from herbs he grows and imports. He sells theriac, the ancient compound remedy used against poisons and pestilence, in small quantities at prices most households strain to afford. He keeps vinegar and sulfur for fumigation purposes. He is doing a significant business. The line outside his shop in the morning of the second week has a quality you have not seen before. People standing with their arms slightly away from their bodies, leaning just perceptibly away from the people next to them, maintaining the smallest extra margin of distance they can manage without making the avoidance explicit. Nobody in the line is touching anyone else unnecessarily. The social conventions that normally govern public space, the casual press of shoulders, the touched arm in emphasis during conversation, have withdrawn, not dramatically but measurably, shot like a tide pulling back from the shore by 3 extra inches. People are adapting their behavior based on observation. They do not have the conceptual framework to name what they are observing or why it changes the risk. They have simply watched people get sick, and they have noticed, without being able to articulate the mechanism, that proximity to the sick seems to precede sickness in the previously healthy. This observation is mostly correct. It is missing the flea. It is missing the bacterium. But it has found the kernel of something true through pure pattern recognition, the way human minds have always navigated environments that threaten them before science explains why. Inside the shop, the apothecary is moving fast and speaking in short, precise sentences. He sells theriac. He sells small bags of dried herbs for fumigation. But he sells vinegar in clay pots. He tells each customer to keep their household fires burning and their windows, counterintuitively, partly open to allow bad air to escape rather than accumulating inside. He believes in miasma theory. He believes the plague is carried in corrupted air, that the air itself has been altered by some combination of planetary influence and terrestrial rot. He is wrong about the mechanism. He's not entirely wrong about the advice, because some of what he is recommending, ventilation, staying away from the sick, fumigation of spaces where the sick have been, carries partial practical benefit even though the reasoning behind it is incorrect. He is also exhausted. His eyes have the dry, reddened quality of a man sleeping inadequately. He has been in this shop since before dawn. He will be here until after dark. He is making compound remedies faster than he has ever made them, and selling them as fast as he makes them, and he is watching, in the faces of the people in his line, the particular expression of people who are buying things they are not certain will work and buying them anyway, because purchasing action in the face of helplessness is how humans manage the unbearable alternative of doing nothing. He develops a swelling under his right arm at the end of the 3rd week. He treats it himself with every compound he has. He applies poultices of fig and onion. He fumigates his shop with burning sulfur. He drinks theriac in doses larger than recommended. He bleeds himself, drawing blood from his arm with a small lancet kept behind the counter, following the logic that the excess of corrupted humors causing the swelling must be expelled. None of it changes anything. He is dead in 6 days. His assistant, a boy of 16 who has been grinding herbs and measuring weights in this shop since age 12, attempts to keep the shop running. He has watched the apothecary work long enough to know the basic compounds. He is not trained. He measures with less precision. He substitutes when ingredients run short. He sells with less authority and more desperation. People buy anyway. On the 14th day of visible outbreak in your town, you are woken before dawn by a sound from the corner where the apprentice sleeps. The sound is the particular controlled breathing of someone trying not to be heard, not quite crying. The sound of someone holding something in with focused muscular effort, the way you hold in a cough during church. You get up, you cross to the corner, and you bring the small oil lamp. The apprentice is sitting on his pallet with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up. His forehead is wet. His eyes, when they catch the lamplight, are glassy with fever in the specific way you have now seen in a dozen faces over 2 weeks. That inward-turned brightness, the look of a body consuming itself from inside. His hands are clasped around his knees and his knuckles are white. You look at his neck, you look under his jaw. You cannot see anything from this angle. You tell him to tilt his head. He does. The swelling under his left ear is already visible in lamplight, a smooth dark rise against the skin that was not there yesterday. You stand there with the lamp and you look at this and you understand precisely what it means. Your wife is awake. She is standing behind you. You hear her breathing change. You hear the small sound that is not a word but contains everything a word would need to contain. You tell her to take the children to her sister's house immediately. The sister lives 3 streets over, has not yet reported illness. Your wife begins to say something and you cut her off. Not unkindly, but with a clarity that you have not used with her before, a tone that carries exactly how much you are not uncertain about this. The children must not be in this building. Your wife's mother, who has bad joints and sleeps through everything, must be woken and told to go with the children. Your wife looks at you for a moment, then she goes to wake the children. You look at the apprentice, Tseka, who has watched this exchange with the flat, glassy eyes of someone running a fever and fully understands that the response to his illness is for everyone else to leave. He was sent to you from his family's farmstead 2 years ago when he was 12. He was the second son of 3. Spare in the way that second sons are spare in a medieval household with one farm and not enough land to split. His arrangement was standard. He works, you feed and house him, you teach him the trade. At the end of his term, he can set up independently or stay on as a journeyman. He has been a good apprentice, careful with materials, quick to learn measurements, slow to make the same mistake twice. He has a quality of sustained attention that is rarer than people think. You pull a stool to the far edge of the corner, far enough to be out of the breathing radius. So you sit on it. You tell him you're not leaving. He looks at you. You tell him what you are going to do. You will keep the fire burning. You will bring water. You will send word to the physician's assistant, who is the only person with any medical authority left in town. You will stay. You do not tell him the physician's assistant is barely more effective than the apothecary's boy at this point. You do not tell him the swelling under his ear is the mark that has been preceding every death in this town for 2 weeks. You do not tell him what the success rate of treatment is, because you have been watching it, and the success rate is approximately what you would calculate if you assigned the question to a coin. You bring water, you bank the fire, you send a neighbor's child with a message. Nurse, you sit on the stool, and you watch the lamp burn, and you listen to the apprentice breathe. The town is beginning to come apart in ways that are both visible and not visible. The visible ways: there are houses on 3 streets now with doors closed during the day, which is unusual in summer when the ground floor workshops stand open as a matter of course. Closed doors mean illness inside, or recent death, or abandonment. You cannot always tell which from the outside. Some households have left entirely, packing what could be carried and moving to farmsteads outside the walls. These departures happen quietly, at odd hours, without announcement. You notice a house is empty because you see it empty, not because anyone told you. The grain on the market square on Tuesday is sold by an unfamiliar face. Someone's wife, someone's elder daughter, standing in for the absent man. The prices are higher. The selection is thinner. The familiar, easy rhythm of market transaction, in which you know the vendor and the vendor knows you and trust is built into the price through long relationship, has been replaced by a more cautious exchange, 2 strangers calculating each other across a pile of grain. The church holds services at the regular hours. The new priest, the 3rd one, reads the prayers with the slightly urgent quality of a man performing the actions of faith as a kind of management of his own fear. The congregation is smaller each week. Some who are absent are sick. Some who are absent have left the town. Some are absent because attending a public gathering now carries a visible risk that their own observation has taught them to calculate, even without a formal framework for doing it. You attend on the Sunday of the 3rd week because not attending would be a form of public statement that you are not prepared to make. You sit in your usual place. The woman who normally sits to your left is absent. The family who normally fills the pew ahead of you is absent. The pew behind you contains 1 old man instead of the usual family of 5. The priest preaches on the theme of divine testing. He says the plague is a judgment requiring penitence. He says that faith, prayer, and correct conduct will provide spiritual protection. He says that those who trust in God need not fear what the body suffers. He says this with force and conviction, and you can hear in his voice that he is saying it partly for himself, partly to fill the silence left by the missing congregation, partly because it is the only account available to him that makes the catastrophe legible. The problem with the account is the evidence. The evidence is the priest who died before him, who administered last rites with perfect religious commitment and died in 14 days regardless. The evidence is the devout families struck down in the same 4-day timeline as the families whose religious observance was less reliable. The evidence is the bedridden nun from the small religious house at the edge of town, who has spent 30 years in almost continuous prayer and who is now burning with fever and a swelling the size of a turnip under her jaw. Now, the account the priest is offering requires you to believe that the pattern of survival and death reflects individual spiritual adequacy. but you have watched too many people die for that to hold. Good people die. Bad people die. Devout people die. The man 3 doors down, who everyone knows cheats on his weights and charges usurious rates on informal loans, is still alive and visibly healthy. His wife, who is known for her generosity to the parish poor box, died on the 9th day of the outbreak. There is no pattern that spiritual accounting can explain. You do not say this. You sit in your pew. You respond at the correct moments. You genuflect. You file out. You go back to the workshop and you bring the apprentice his water and you check the swelling and you measure its growth against the mark you made yesterday on a piece of cord tied loosely around his neck. It is larger, about 1/3 again as large as yesterday. The apprentice does not die on the 4th day. This is surprising. You have been watching the timeline so closely, tracking the interval between first visible symptoms and death in case after case, that you have built a grim expectation around the 4th day as the point beyond which most people do not pass. The swelling under his ear has grown substantially. There is now a second swelling in his left armpit, which he discovered himself and reported to you with the careful precision with which he reports everything, as if cataloguing rather than experiencing. He has a fever that has not broken in 3 days. He is in constant pain from the swellings, which he manages with a stillness that looks like acceptance but is actually just the only strategy available when movement makes it worse. He eats very little. He drinks water consistently, which matters more. He is conscious and sometimes almost alert, capable of short exchanges, then retreating back into the focused inward state of severe illness. On the 5th day, the swelling under his ear begins, very slightly, to soften. You press it with 2 fingers through the cloth, and the sensation is different from yesterday, marginally less rigid. Now you do this 3 times to verify what you are feeling, and then you sit back, and you look at him, and he looks at you, and you say nothing because saying anything seems like the kind of thing that could undo it. On the 7th day, his fever drops, not gone, but reduced in the way that a fire that has been burning hard settles into a lower, steadier burn. He sleeps more than before. The sleep is different, less like unconsciousness, more like actual rest, the body falling into the particular depth that healing requires, rather than the shallow burning quality of fever sleep. On the 9th day, he eats a full bowl of pottage. On the 10th day, he sits up. He is not the only one in the town who survives. The plague's mortality rate, while devastating, is not absolute. Some fraction of those infected, perhaps 1 in 4, perhaps slightly more, do not die. The mechanism of why some survive and others do not is not understood by anyone in the 14th century, and the surviving individuals have no consistent profile. They are not the strongest or the most devout or the most careful. They are the ones whose bodies manage, through some combination of immune response and chance variation, in exposure dose and the particular direction of the bacterium's assault, to navigate past the crisis point and onto the other side. The apprentice is one of these. He sits up on the 10th day and looks around the workshop with the stunned expression of someone who has been somewhere else entirely and is now returning to a space that is exactly the same and completely different. He looks at the walls, the tools on their hooks, the grain of the timber, and the way the afternoon light falls across the floor. He looks at all of it for a long time. Then he asks if anyone else in the household is ill. You tell him your wife's mother died 4 days ago at your wife's sister's house, having lasted only 2 days after showing symptoms. You tell him your wife is well, your children are well. You tell him the sexton stopped ringing the bell 6 days ago, not because the dead had stopped arriving, but because the sexton had joined them, and the bell has been silent since. The silence where the bell was is a different kind of sound. The town has become accustomed to the ringing, has restructured its sense of time around the ringing, has used the ringing as the audible measure of how bad things were. The silence does not mean things are better. It means the mechanism for marking badness has broken. The apprentice takes this information in with the face of someone receiving a report they already expected but needed to hear confirmed. He does not ask about the specific numbers. He has done the arithmetic of absence himself, counting the closed doors and the empty market stalls, and the unfamiliar faces in familiar places, and he has arrived at an estimate that is probably close to accurate. He does not ask, because knowing the exact number will not change anything and will only make it heavier to carry. He drinks the rest of his water. He lies back down. He sleeps for 14 more hours. The burial pits are outside the east wall. You know they are there because you saw them being dug, the activity of it visible from the lane that runs along the outside of the wall. And a crew of men with shovels working by torchlight in the second week, when the individual parish graves could no longer absorb the rate of incoming dead. The crew was assembled by the town council at emergency session, their authority expanded by crisis into areas it normally does not touch. They issued the directive to dig the pits, assigned the gravediggers and their wages, commandeered land that belonged technically to a landowner outside the wall who was in no position to refuse. The pits are long and wide and not very deep, because deep is harder and slower, and the rate of bodies does not wait for proper depth. They are lined with quick lime where it can be sourced. Bodies are interred without full ceremony in most cases, wrapped in whatever cloth can be spared, placed alongside others with minimal separation. The markers where they exist, are simple: a wooden stake with a name scratched onto it, or in some cases, no marker at all. You know a man who worked in the pit crew for 5 days before falling ill himself. He was one of the civic grave diggers, a man whose ordinary job was digging individual graves in the parish cemetery under instruction from the parish priest. He had dug graves for 30 years and had a particular skill for it, the kind of technical knowledge that attaches to a profession over decades. How to read the soil, how to calculate dimensions, how to work efficiently in various weather conditions, how to manage the physical cost of the work across a long day. He told you, in the brief window between his return from the crew and the onset of his symptoms, that the hardest thing about the pit work was not the physical labor or the smell or the darkness. It was the arithmetic of the bodies, which arrived faster than the pit could process them, which meant that at any given moment there were bodies waiting, covered with cloth, lined up along the wall in a row that stretched further every morning. The mathematical reality of that row, which was the town's dead made visible and countable, was the thing that would not leave his mind. He showed you his hands when he said this, calloused, abraded, stained with the particular earth color that deep digging produces. He said he kept counting the row. He could not stop. He said it was like not being able to stop counting your own heartbeats once you become aware of them. He was dead 6 days later, and the pit crew went through 5 men before the worst of the mortality had passed. Each replacement came in fresh, did the work as long as he could, and then either fell ill or simply walked away when the psychological weight became non-carryable. The pits outside the east wall hold, in the end, somewhere between 300 and 400 bodies. In a town of 3,000, this is between 1/10 and 1/7 of the entire population, concentrated into an area roughly the size of a large garden. When the plague subsides enough for the pits to be sealed, not closed in any formal commemorative sense, simply covered and left, the area outside the east wall becomes difficult to use for anything else. The soil is changed. The land has a quality about it that is not quite superstition and not quite practical concern, nor a zone of avoidance that will persist for generations without being formally maintained. This is what plague leaves in the ground. Not just bodies. A change in how the land is understood. The economic collapse happens slowly in some ways and instantly in others. The slow version. Markets thin over weeks. Trade routes narrow as traders avoid known plague towns. Prices shift unpredictably as supply chains lose workers and transportation. Rents are still demanded but increasingly difficult to collect as debtor households simply cease to exist. Guild structures weaken as masters die without trained replacements and apprentices attempt to fill roles for which they are not yet qualified. The instant version, a craft workshop with 3 workers and 1 master is, upon the death of 2 of those workers, suddenly a craft workshop with 2 workers and no one who knows the full technical procedure. This is not a gradual degradation, it is an overnight structural break. The missing knowledge cannot be reconstructed from what remains. Some portion of the production dies with the person who held it. Your guild brother 3 streets over made a particular form of metal fixture used in the construction of window frames. He was the only person in the town who made this specific fixture, which required a technique he had learned from his own master and had been refining for 20 years. He died in the 3rd week of the outbreak. His son, who was just beginning his apprenticeship, knows the general outlines of the process, but not its subtleties. The fixtures the son makes are functional, but not quite right. Too heavy in some dimensions, near slightly imprecise in the joints. Contractors who know the difference use them anyway because there is no alternative. Contractors who do not know the difference use them without knowing the difference. The knowledge itself is gone. It will take years to redevelop it through trial and error, and it will not come back through the son, who is now doing the work of a journeyman at the age of 13, because the guild has nobody else. Every workshop in the town that loses its master experiences some version of this. Knowledge dies. Technique degrades. The replacement who steps into the role is working at a disadvantage that the previous practitioner never had. At the same time, the labor shortage that the deaths create begins producing a different kind of pressure on the social hierarchy. And when this pressure moves in a direction that the hierarchy does not want. Surviving craftsmen and agricultural workers find themselves in a position they have never occupied before. Scarce. Before the plague, labor was abundant. There were always more workers than positions. The conditions of the labor relationship favored the employer. Wages were set by custom and by the weight of supply. A worker who demanded more than the established rate could simply be replaced. That calculation is now broken. The blacksmith in the next parish has lost 2 of his 3 workers. He needs them. There is 1 surviving blacksmith's assistant in the region who is not currently attached to a forge. This man knows his own value for the first time. He names a wage. The blacksmith pays it, or he finds his forge standing cold. The surviving agricultural laborer on the Lord's estate watches 3 neighboring estates failing to bring in their harvest because they do not have enough workers. He walks off his estate. He walks to one of the failing estates. He accepts a wage contract that would have been unthinkable a year ago. The Lord's steward writes an angry letter and threatens legal action and gets no result because the mechanism for enforcing that legal action has also been thinned by death. The social order, which has maintained its structure for a century, partly through the demographics of labor surplus, is beginning to experience pressure at its foundations. The order does not collapse. It adapts defensively with the reflex of a structure protecting itself from change. And town councils and regional lords issue emergency wage statutes. Wages must be held at pre-plague levels. Workers who accept above statute wages are subject to fine. Landlords attempt to enforce the labor obligations of serfs who have moved to different estates. The legal apparatus that normally maintains hierarchy is deployed against the arithmetic of its own population. Some of these edicts hold. Many do not. The gap between what the law requires and what the labor market actually produces widens in a way that the law cannot close by force, because the force is also thinned by death. The men who enforce the edicts are fewer than before. You watch this happening from the level of your workshop, which is the level at which most of it is experienced. Not as institutional analysis, but as the daily reality of what things cost, what work is available, what your neighbors are willing to do and for whom and at what price. Your wife's sister's household loses a child in the 4th week. The child is 4 years old. Her name is, you know her name. You are not going to think about her name right now because there is work to do, and thinking about her name is the entrance to a room you cannot go into while there is still work to do. The child developed symptoms quickly, faster than most. A fever in the morning, and by evening she was unconscious, the swelling under her jaw already visible at 4 years old as a hard distortion of the smooth curve of her face. She did not survive the night. Your wife's sister is a woman of substantial practical capacity who has managed her household through the illness and death of her own mother-in-law and 3 neighbors, and has done this with the focused, forward-looking attention that survival requires. When you see her at the church 3 days after the child's death, not at a regular service but at an outdoor penitence gathering organized by the surviving priest, she looks like a woman who has made a decision about what she will carry and what she will not allow herself to carry, at least until there is time. Her eyes are dry. Her face is arranged. The grief is there in the quality of her stillness, in the way she holds herself slightly more carefully than usual, as if the structural supports inside her are managing a new weight distribution. And you stand next to her, and you do not say anything, and she does not say anything, and you stand there together through the priest's prayers. The outdoor gathering is a form of collective spiritual management. The priest has organized it because the regular Sunday services are no longer adequate to the emotional scale of what the community is experiencing. People need to express their fear and grief in a communal format. The church provides the structure for this. Penitence, the formal expression of collective guilt and the appeal for divine mercy, is the theological mechanism available. Several hundred people stand in the market square in the afternoon heat. They are too close together. The priest does not know this is a problem, and they do not know this is a problem, and the problem does not care what they know. An airborne transmission is not the primary vector of the plague. It is fleas and rats and the direct contact with the ill. But the gathering clusters people from different parts of the town who have been in different exposure environments, and it introduces new combinations of contact between people who might otherwise not have met that week. 3 people at this gathering are in the early incubation phase of their illness, not yet showing symptoms, not yet aware that they are carrying anything. They stand in the crowd, they breathe. They walk home afterward to households that were previously uninfected. The priest gives a good account of divine love and human frailty and the need for penitence in times of trial. He says these things with genuine feeling. He's not wrong about the spiritual reality of what he is describing. He is simply not in possession of the information that would lead him to the different conclusion about the most useful form of gathering at this particular moment. You take your wife home. The children have been left with a neighbor. The apprentice is sitting up, still weak but improved, and has spent the afternoon doing light work with his hands, cutting cord and organizing material, the kind of task that exercises the hands without the body. The harvest season arrives on schedule because the season does not consult the population. The grain in the fields outside the town walls has been growing since spring. It is ripe now in the way that grain is ripe at the end of summer, heavy-headed, bending slightly under its own weight, golden and dry, and requiring cutting within the next 2 to 3 weeks before it begins to turn, or the autumn rains threaten it. The window for harvest is not flexible. It is determined by the biological cycle of the crop and the meteorological rhythm of the region. Miss the window and the grain spoils or stands in the wet until it cannot be stored. The problem is straightforward. There are not enough harvesters. The farms surrounding your town normally hire additional labor at harvest time, supplementing the permanent workers with temporary field hands who travel the harvest circuit, moving from one region to the next as the crop ripens at slightly different times at different latitudes. This system of temporary harvest labor is a reliable seasonal mechanism, one of the structural rhythms of medieval agricultural life. And in a normal year, it works. The workers arrive, the grain comes in, the winter supply is secured. This is not a normal year. The temporary harvest workers are dying along the roads they travel. Some fields they might have come from have already lost so many of their regular workers that the temporary labor market has redirected to try to fill those gaps first. The network has fractured in multiple places simultaneously. On the farms around your town, the landowners and their stewards are attempting to bring in harvest with whatever workers remain. In some cases, this means the landowner himself is in the field, which is not a common sight. The social lines between those who own land and those who work it are normally maintained with care as part of the apparatus of hierarchical order. Those lines are now negotiated against the immediate reality of grain standing in the field with nobody to cut it. 2 farms within a mile of the town walls bring in their harvest adequately, with reduced crews working longer hours. 1 farm brings in half its crop before the remaining workers fall too ill to continue. The grain stands in the field past optimal harvest. The rain comes. The loss is substantial. 1 farm is simply abandoned for the season. The family that owned it has died. The steward who managed it has died. The workers who farmed it have scattered. The grain grows and ripens and stands too long and begins to fail in the wet autumn weather, and nobody cuts it. Neighboring landowners cannot take it without legal process that is currently not functioning. The grain rots. In the town, as the late autumn approaches, the price of grain continues to climb. This is not a surprise to anyone watching the mechanism. Reduced harvest, reduced supply, stable demand from surviving population. The arithmetic is simple. What is not simple is that the population least able to absorb price increases. The landless laborers, the craftsmen working reduced hours in shops thinned by death, the widowed households that have lost a primary earner, are exactly the households least able to cope with the additional pressure of food inflation on top of everything else. The winter ahead is going to be harder than any winter in living memory, for reasons that have nothing to do with cold. In the 5th week, the rate of new deaths begins to slow. This is not initially perceptible as a trend. A single week with fewer deaths might be a fluctuation. By the 2nd consecutive week of reduced daily mortality, the pattern is becoming harder to dismiss. The bell rope, which has been pulled by a series of rotating volunteers after the sexton died, is rung less frequently. The morning toll, which had been happening at daily intervals, goes 2 days without ringing. Then 3. The plague is not gone. Cases continue to appear. People continue to die. But the rate has dropped from the catastrophic compression of the height of the wave. 4 or 5 deaths in a single day, the mass burial pit receiving new bodies every night, to something closer to 2 or 3 deaths per week, which is still vastly above normal mortality, but begins to feel, by comparison, like a loosening. The loosening is misleading in some ways. The disease has not been defeated by treatment or prayer or quarantine measures. It has reached, within this population, the boundaries of its current accessible host pool. The mechanism of its slowdown is the same as the mechanism of its devastation. It is moving through people, and it has moved through enough of the densely connected center of the population that the network of frequent proximity contacts has thinned. The survivors are those who happen to be at the periphery of the transmission network at the right time, or those whose immune systems managed the specific challenge of this bacterium, or those who left the town at the right moment, or those who for various reasons of circumstance had less frequent contact with the infected. They are alive, so they are not safe in any permanent sense. The plague will return in subsequent waves, and the long-term survivors will face it again. But for now, in this town, in this year, the acute phase is diminishing. This diminishment does not feel like victory. It feels like standing in a field after a fire has passed through. The fire is no longer burning. The field is still ash. In the weeks following the peak of mortality, the town undertakes the practical work of continuing to exist. This work is enormous and largely unacknowledged. Every institution that the plague has damaged must assess its own condition and determine whether it can maintain function with what remains. The guild system takes stock of absent masters, counts surviving journeymen and apprentices. Niem makes decisions about who will be permitted to operate at what level, with what supervisory oversight. In normal times, these decisions follow strict procedural rules built up over generations to ensure quality control and equitable competition. In these times, the decisions are made rapidly by whoever remains in position to make them, with the rules bent where bending is the only alternative to complete institutional failure. The Church attempts the same kind of triage. A diocese that has lost a third of its clergy is not a functional diocese in the sense that existed before the plague. Services can still be held. Sacraments can still be administered, but the depth of coverage, the number of people each priest can adequately serve, the speed with which spiritual needs can be addressed, and the maintenance of all the institutional records and obligations that religious life requires, is permanently reduced until new ordinations can catch up. New ordinations take years. The replacement clergy being rushed into service are sometimes undertrained. They have learned what can be learned in compressed time, but the full formation of a priest requires years of education and practical mentorship under experienced practitioners. The experienced practitioners are the ones who died. The replacements are working from incomplete formation in positions that require complete formation, and the people they serve can feel the difference, not always articulately, but in the particular way a community feels when the people it relies on for spiritual authority are visibly uncertain. Town governance attempts a similar reconstruction, and the civic council, which normally operates through the accumulated authority of established merchants and property owners, finds itself reconstituted with new members who have inherited their positions through death rather than through the normal processes of civic selection. Some of these new members bring energy and practical competence. Some bring only the coincidence of survival and property ownership. The difference matters for governance quality, but is difficult to sort quickly. The physical infrastructure of the town requires attention that has been deferred during the crisis. Buildings stand vacant and are beginning to show the rapid deterioration of unoccupied structures. Windows damaged by weather, small roof leaks that expand without repair, the incremental breakdown of maintenance. Some of these buildings will be reclaimed by surviving family members when property claims are sorted through the slow mechanism of probate and inheritance. Some will sit empty for years because the chain of inheritance has been broken at multiple points, and the legal resolution of competing claims is a complex process even in normal times. The empty buildings are a persistent visual presence in the town's daily life. You walk past them. You see the closed shutters. You see the small signs of abandonment, weeds beginning to push up around the threshold, the weathering at the corners of the frame where paint has not been refreshed, the particular stillness of a building with no one inside it. Every empty building on your street is a person or a family that is no longer there. You do not think about this constantly. You cannot. The work of daily life demands most of the available attention. There is the workshop to maintain, the commissions to fulfill, the household to sustain. The apprentice, recovered but still weaker than he was before, works at reduced capacity. You carry more of the production load yourself. Your wife takes on additional duties that her mother-in-law had handled. The household is 4 people now instead of 6. It runs because 4 people do the work that 6 people were doing before. By the time the autumn turns fully cold, the outbreak has retreated to a low-level smolder. New cases still appear at the rate of perhaps 1 or 2 per week across the town. These cases follow the same course as before. The fever, the swelling, the rapid decline in most, the occasional survival against expectation, and nobody has found a way to prevent exposure or reliably treat those who are exposed. The mechanisms that people have developed, the avoidance behaviors, the vinegar washing, the fumigation with burning herbs, provide some marginal protection in some cases and none in others. The burial pits outside the east wall have been sealed with earth and lime and left. The parish register, which fell behind during the peak of the outbreak, will never be fully reconstructed. The gap in the record is approximately 8 weeks, a stretch of time during which people were born and married and died at extraordinary rates. And none of it was written down, because the people who write things down were managing the immediate crisis and then dying from it. The record exists as a before and after, to two bodies of carefully maintained documentation with an 8-week void between them. Future readers of this register will see the void and understand, even without explanation, what it represents. The town will spend the next 2 years processing the legal and economic consequences of the deaths. Property disputes, inheritance claims, guild reorganizations, feudal obligation renegotiations. All of these require time and institutional attention that is itself constrained by the reduced population of people capable of handling it. Some claims will be resolved, some will remain in ambiguous states for years. Some will simply be abandoned when the claimants can no longer sustain the effort of pursuing them through a system that is functioning at reduced capacity. The apprentice, by the spring following the outbreak, has recovered most of his physical strength. The swelling under his ear has subsided entirely, leaving only a slight discoloration that fades over the following months. He works at full capacity by early spring, with the focused attention he always had, now supplemented by something additional that is harder to name. A kind of calibration. The specific way a person's perception of daily existence shifts when they have been very close to not existing. He does not speak about the illness often. When he does, he speaks about it with the same careful precision with which he reported the second swelling when he found it. Matter of fact, observational, as if describing the work of an external force on a material he was assessing. He does not perform drama about it. He does not claim transformation. He simply proceeded when he could stand, under with the work. You respect this more than you can say. There is a particular quality to the streets of the town in the months following the peak of the outbreak that is difficult to articulate, but immediately apparent to anyone walking through them. It is an absence quality. Every public space that was previously filled to a certain density is now filled to a lesser density. The market square on Tuesday has the same physical dimensions it always had, the same arrangement of stalls, the same cobblestones sloping slightly toward the central drain. But the density of people moving through it is reduced. The noise level is lower. The specific babble of many overlapping conversations that is the acoustic texture of a functioning market has thinned. You can hear individual exchanges more clearly because there are fewer of them. This is not a temporary post-crisis quiet that will rebuild within a few weeks. The population that produced that density is not coming back. The children who will eventually replace the dead are not yet born. The migrants who might move into the empty buildings are not yet arriving in numbers sufficient to fill them. The town is, for the immediate future, operating at somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of its former population, and the spaces that were built for a larger population reflect this. The church, which was designed to hold a congregation of 3,000, holds a congregation of perhaps 2,000 on a good Sunday. The empty pews are not removed. They sit there. The congregation distributes itself within them in patterns that, week by week, slowly recalibrate toward the center to avoid the visual emphasis of the empty sections along the sides, a gradual collective reclustering that is never discussed and happens entirely through the small daily decisions of where each person happens to sit. The market accommodates its reduced scale by contracting. Stalls that were in the outer ring of the square are abandoned. The active market pulls inward over the following months, a slow gravitational reorganization around the remaining vendors. The outer ring, where the empty stalls stand, acquires the quality of a margin, still technically market space, still technically available, but de facto relinquished. You notice this. You notice the way the town is finding its new shape, filling in the human topography of its reduced population. It is doing this without guidance and without planning, simply through the aggregate of individual decisions about where to set up, where to stand, where to buy, where to live. The institution of the market is reconstructing itself through these small decisions, the same way a river reconstructs its channel after a flood. The channel is different, but there is still a channel. The town will survive. You do not doubt this. You doubt many specific things: the adequacy of the coming winter food supply, the stability of the guild reorganization, the long-term viability of 3 workshops that are currently operating on insufficient personnel. But the larger fact of the town's continuation feels secure in the way that structures which have been under enormous pressure and held feel secure, not invulnerable, tested. Your wife's mother is buried in the pit outside the east wall with 400 others. You know which section she is in because you were present when she was brought out, wrapped in cloth, carried by 2 hired men at the pace of men who have been doing this work for weeks and have developed the specific efficiency of those who must keep moving regardless of the weight in their hands. You watched them carry her through the east gate. You stood there until they were through the gate, and then you went back to work because your wife was at her sister's house, managing her sister's grief, and the children were with a neighbor, and someone needed to be in the workshop. There is no marker with her name on it. There is earth over her and lime and the season's first frost beginning to harden the surface. In the spring, you will plant something nearby in the field at the edge of the pit zone, not directly over her because you do not know the exact coordinates, but close enough to be a gesture toward location. You will plant something that comes back every year. You have not decided what yet. The bell begins ringing again in the 3rd month after the sexton died. It is rung now by a young man hired specifically for the purpose, 17 years old, the son of a tanner, not from a bell-ringing family, but willing and regular. He has been taught the canonical hours and the death-marking protocol by the surviving priest. He rings on time. His rhythm is slightly different from his predecessors, a shade more deliberate, the intervals between swings marginally longer. But it is recognizable as the same bell, the same function, the same signal threading through the daily acoustic environment of the town. The first morning you hear it ring for the canonical hour, and not for a death. You stop what you are doing. You are at the workbench. The bell rings at terse, the mid-morning hour, and it rings at the standard interval, and then stops. No additional toll, no cluster of rapid rings indicating an emergency death notification, just the canonical marking and silence. The apprentice is working at the end of the bench. He stops too. He looks up. He is counting in the same way you are counting, waiting for the additional ring that would mean another death, the sequence of single slow rings that the town has spent weeks associating with mortality. The additional ring does not come. You both go back to work. But the moment persists, and the specific quality of that counted silence, the weight of not ringing, the ordinary sound of a day proceeding without a death in it. It is not joy, it is not relief exactly. It is something quieter and more durable than either of those, a settling, the specific mental adjustment that occurs when a threat has not disappeared, but has receded to a distance where ordinary life can operate around it. The bell rings the midday hour, the bell rings none, the bell rings vespers, the bell rings none. A full day passes and no one in the town dies of plague. The next day, 2 people die, but the day after that, none, and the day after that, none, and after that, 1, and then none for a week. The plague has not finished with Europe. It will return in subsequent decades. These smaller waves that strike populations that have begun to forget the scale of what the first wave was. The children who are currently 5 and 6 years old, who have no clear memory of the outbreak, will face a second wave in their 20s and will face it without the visceral reference point that their parents have. The parents will have the reference point and will use it to try to prepare, and some of what they remember will be accurate, and some of it will be distorted by time and fear into shapes that do not quite map onto the next wave's specific behavior. The world has not been made safe. It has been made differently dangerous. A population reduced, a social structure under new pressures, a set of assumptions about the survivability of illness permanently revised at the level of collective memory. A generation of survivors carrying the particular weight of having watched the people around them disappear with a speed that no framework available to them could adequately explain. You are alive. The word for what this means in this specific context requires precision. You're not alive because you were stronger than those who died. You're not alive because your faith was more adequate, your remedies more effective, your precautions more rigorous. You kept your children away from the infected household on your street. You kept the apprentice isolated when he fell ill. You washed your hands with vinegar water. You did all the things that the available knowledge suggested. None of those things can account for your survival with any reliability. The tailor's wife did nothing wrong. The priest did everything right, by the lights available to him, and he died in 14 days. The apothecary had more knowledge of medical practice than anyone in the town and died applying it to himself. What you have is the negative of exposure. You are not in the wrong room at the wrong hour. Your household was not in the direct path of the transmission chain at its most active point. The flea that could have found you found someone else. This is not a plan. It is not a merit. It is the arithmetic of probability operating across a population, producing survivors and victims according to rules that have nothing to do with the qualities of the individuals involved. You know this. You knew it even before the plague, in the way you knew that the cart accident that killed the miller's son when he was 14 had nothing to do with anything the boy had done, as you knew the world operated with this quality of indifference. You had simply never seen it operate at this scale, with this speed, at this concentration. The knowledge is different when you have watched it happen to people whose faces you know. In the second spring following the outbreak, a wool merchant comes through on his regular circuit, which he had suspended during the worst of the mortality. He is the same merchant who came through 2 years ago and mentioned the ships arriving dead at southern ports. He's a stout man with a grey beard and the particular traveling merchant posture of someone who spends more time on the road than anywhere else. A forward lean, a readiness of attention, a quick intake of his surroundings wherever he stops. He was not in this town during the outbreak. He was in a different town, which also had an outbreak, in which he lost his assistant and his 2 pack animals and nearly died himself before recovering. He carries evidence of this in the slightly rough quality of his voice, which the illness left changed. He sets up his stall in the reduced market. He has wool and dye and, in one case, a small packet of printed documents that someone in the South is distributing. A summary, in plain language, of observations made during the plague years about the behavior of the disease. The document is brief, inaccurate in several important particulars, and wildly speculative about causation. It attributes the plague to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius, a celestial event it claims corrupted the air throughout Europe and produced the pestilence through atmospheric mechanisms. So the document is wrong. But it represents a specific kind of response that the plague has generated across Europe. The attempt to find a rational account at the scale of the catastrophe. People who experienced the outbreak want to understand what happened. They want to know whether it can be predicted, whether its next occurrence can be anticipated by watching the skies, whether the loss of 1/3 of Europe's population can be placed within a framework that makes sense. The celestial account is wrong. But the impulse behind it is the same impulse that drives all attempts to bring pattern to experience that appears to lack it. You buy a length of wool from the merchant. You do not buy the document. You already have an account of what the plague was like. You do not need a document to give you one. So the account you have is made of specific things: the sound of the bell ringing without stopping, the tailor's wife 4 days from health to death, the apprentice's fever and his 10th day, and the bowl of pottage, the pit outside the east wall, the way the market contracts toward its center like a pupil in bright light, the sexton's hands wrapped in cloth, still pulling, The particular silence when the additional ring does not come after the canonical hour. This is the account that lives inside a body that was present. It does not require celestial mechanics. It does not require a framework. It was simply what happened. Here, in this town, in this summer, in the years of the great pestilence that came from the south, along the wool roads and the spice roads and the letter roads and every other road the medieval world had built to move what it needed from place to place. The plague moved the same way everything moved. It did not need special roads. It used the ones that were already there. Your children do not remember most of it. The older one was 8 during the outbreak's peak and retains specific images. The closed shutters on the tailor's house, the sound of the bell, the period of staying at the aunt's house, which she understood at the time as adventure, before understanding it later as flight. She does not remember the full weight of those weeks because 8 is too young to carry the full weight. What she retains is the outline, and a shape without the interior pressure that filled it for the adults. The younger one was 5. He remembers almost nothing specific. What he will know about the plague for most of his life is the shape of its absence, the houses on his street that stand empty until he is 12, the gap in the parish register that no one can explain to him because the explanation requires knowing how to read, the particular quiet of the market that persisted for years and that he accepts as the market's normal state because he has no comparison point. He will grow up in a town that has been thinned, and he will take its current density as normal, the same way you took the density before the plague as normal, the same way every generation takes the world it finds as the baseline world against which change is measured. This is how catastrophe becomes history, not through forgetting, but through the generation that follows inheriting the aftermath as its starting point and building from there, forward-looking by necessity, the weight of what happened receding into a story that gets shorter with each retelling until it is a date and a name and a number in a document. The people who died have already become, in the parish record's gap, an absence of writing. The gap is 8 weeks. 8 weeks in which something between 300 and 400 people transitioned from living entries to nothing at all. No record, no individual mark, just the gap, and then the resumption of record-keeping on the other side. The bell rings for vespers. You're still at the workbench when it rings. The afternoon light has gone golden at the angle that means an hour remains before dark. The apprentice has gone to the market to collect an order. Your wife is upstairs. The workshop has the particular quiet of a space used all day settling into the end of its use. The bell rings its 5 strokes for vespers and stops. Nobody has died today. The bell will ring again tomorrow at matins and terce and sext and none and vespers. It will ring for deaths when deaths occur, and they will occur, because death does not stop occurring. The town is 3/4 of what it was. It is building back from there, through the slow mechanism of births and arrivals, and the reorganization of every institution that survived at reduced capacity. It will take a generation to rebuild to something close to previous scale. It will not be rebuilt by the people who remember the loss, but by their children and by the children of those children who will live in a world shaped by an event they did not witness. The sexton who pulled the rope until his hands bled is in the pit outside the east wall. The priest who administered last rites until he could not is buried in the churchyard, one of the few plague dead to receive a proper, individual burial, a small courtesy extended to his status that the 380 others in the pit were not extended. The tailor's wife, who was planning her garden. The apothecary with the calloused hands and the dry red eyes, still dispensing Theria when the swelling was already under his arm. The grandmother with the bad joints who was certain she had survived enough to survive this. The 4-year-old. The assistant priest. The 3rd priest. The grave diggers rotating through the pit crew. The baker's wife. The cheese seller's father. The sexton. All of them in the same earth, outside the same wall, in the same compressed time, which is the only thing the plague leveled without distinction. It took the time it took regardless of who you were, and it was faster than anything the town had ever seen, and the town continues, and they do not. This is what dying from the Black Death was. Not the fever alone, not the swelling alone, not the black blotches or the hemorrhaging or the pain of lymph nodes grown to the size of an infant's fist. All of those things, yes, but also the speed, the terrible, mechanical, indifferent speed, at which the social architecture built to manage death was simply outpaced by the rate of dying. So leaving behind a community that had to watch its own systems fail in real time, one bell toll at a time, one closed shutter at a time, one empty pew at a time, until the wave had passed and what remained had to find a way to be enough. It was enough. It was not what it was before. It would never be what it was before. The bell rings none.